Welcome back to Arguing with the Internet. On today's episode, we're discussing the question, should we abolish the death penalty? Now, the title's pretty straightforward and it explains it all, so why don't we just go ahead and jump into the internet arguments. You got the first one for us, Matt?
Yeah. So once again, this first one comes from Reddit, of course. In response to someone's question, those who support the death penalty, why do you support capital punishment, right? This person responds, because sometimes some people are so thoroughly incapable of rehabilitation and commit crimes so unspeakable that keeping them alive is an insult to civilization. Besides, killing them is more humane than locking them in a 2x3 square for 50 plus years in the first place. Best way? Guillotine. You can't possibly mess it up. Organs are usable for transplant. It's quick and it doesn't rely on chemicals. When someone commits an atrocity so savage that it offends mankind as a whole. Torture, genocide, aggravated rape, seriously aggravated murder. I'm talking at least 2 separate aggravants to be even eligible. 99% of all crimes don't deserve death, even very serious ones. But for others, any sentence other than death is an insult to the victims. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Like 5 or 6 individual points here. Do you want to just start from the top and work our way down?
Yeah, I think this is
really grabs you before.
Well, I mean, the thing that grabbed me is the guillotine comment. I don't. When I was looking for arguments, I didn't really see anybody else arguing for that. I have heard people talk about. I mean, I think it's an interesting topic because people do, if they're anti-death penalty, will often point to the method as being bad. So, like the electric chair,
especially those where botched executions can occur.
Right, things that can be botched. So, like even lethal injection is often botched because you don't have medical professionals performing it. And so with guillotine, I mean, maybe like it seems fairly straightforward. Like the person can't move, and as long as you get a sharp blade above their head, like I mean, maybe, I'm sure it's been botched before because it's been done enough times. But that's
sure. I mean, it has the reputation of being fast and reliable.
Right.
But there's also, this might just be like false history or something. I don't really know the facts, but isn't there the like it's so quick that you might remain conscious for like a split second or something like that after it's done.
Right.
Maybe that's all baloney, right? But if so, maybe that would weigh in this person's choice,
yeah. Well, that may happen with other methods too. It's just, but I've heard that like someone instructed someone to like blink after they had their head cut off, and the head like blinked for 30 seconds or so, which is pretty disturbing.
So I've seen people advocate for hanging because it is supposed to, when done correctly, which is, like you adjust the height of the rope based on weight and the person's height, etc. It's supposed to be very fast. In fact, that is Singapore's like required method because they are very much involved with capital punishment. Like they've done research on it and decided that's what they were going to stick with. But this person seems to have other reasons for preferring the guillotine too, right? It's not just that it's like quick and reliable. They specifically mention that it would allow the organs of the executed to be usable for transplant, right? So there's some element here of like getting some use out of the criminal as well, where such a thing doesn't happen if you simply subject them to like a chemical injection or a firing squad or something more brutal than that.
But yeah, that stood out to me because I wonder in this person's mind, is that a choice that the person executed gets to make, or is that just the state decides, okay, we'll use your organs for transplant? Because if they get to make that choice, I guess that could be something good that could come out of the bad situation, but it seems a little different if it's by force.
Yeah, the implication that I'm getting here, this person does not say this directly, to be fair, but from the tone of the overall response, the vibe I'm getting is that no, we would be able to harvest their organs for use, and therefore like make use of this body that would otherwise be useless to us, regardless
Right.
of like whether the prisoner wished for that to happen or not. There's several issues that you run into when that's your concern, right? Like some people are going to have religious objections, for example, like a mutilated body might interfere with their religious beliefs in regards to their afterlife or something like that, right? And that's kind of messed up. Two, you don't want to provide the state with any sort of incentive for executing people, right? Like,
Yeah.
if suddenly the bodies of the executed are usable, that's somewhat scary.
Yeah, I don't know if it'd be realistically possible anyway, because I've heard doctors generally won't apply or like provide the lethal injection or do anything that ends up anything involved in the execution. And this is sort of not directly involved, but they have the principle of do no harm, and like taking organs from someone who was killed. Like it's kind of, I guess, this gray zone. So I don't even know if that would work realistically.
Yeah, but there's some consequentialist concerns too. You know, like if you're a doctor with any consequentialist bone in your body, there are these organs here now that are usable and could save lives, right? But the final thing I wanted to bring up is that typically people who are in support of capital punishment think of execution as like the only payment that can be given in order to restore justice, right? But what comes with that, for certain crimes, of course, but what comes as a consequence of that is that once you have paid the price, it seems like you've met the demands of justice, right? And so I'm not sure that the state or the victims, once the execution has occurred, have any longer like a claim, right? Like to their body or whatever, right? It seems like if you've paid the price, you're done, right? So this idea that like, oh, well, some ways of execution could make them more usable afterwards, that seems a bit strange to me. But this is kind of like
Seems a little incongruous too with this person talking about crimes that are an insult to civilization, like keeping the person alive is like somehow this egregious thing. But at the same time, if you're using a person as like an organ donation bag or something like that, that's also kind of in the same vein of to me. So like it seems a little incongruous if that is the point they're making, that we should just
I think
sort of
what they're
take
trying to say is just like, one, it's acceptable, in fact, probably obligatory to execute some people. And two, given that we should be executing some people, the best way to do it is a way in which like there's something useful that comes out of it. Right. So I don't think they're not going about this in the opposite way around, where they're saying like, oh, well, if we execute people like this, we could get body parts. And now let's talk about who we execute. Right. I think they're approaching it in the right way. It just has these strange like implications that might be a little unsettling or might provoke some moral objection that might have been unforeseen by this person. So more of a minor critique than accusing them of like purposefully wanting to like bring people to the guillotine just for the organs. But
I do think that's I think it's an interesting, like the first comment they make. It is interesting to talk about keeping someone alive. They say it's an insult to civilization, but it does seem that I could sympathize with this where there's crimes. You can think of like serial killers who do sadistic murders for like killing dozens of people, let's say. It does seem like it's not fitting to keep them alive. Like even if they're in jail, they can't harm, or in prison, they can't harm anyone. Like the fact that Ted Bundy or like John Wayne Gacy, or like some people like that could be alive, like for decades and decades after they commit the crimes. It does seem like, you know, that it's not right that they just can. It seems like the crimes they committed are so egregious that like it almost seems like it's keeping them alive.
I hear you. Yeah. I think that's like a common sentiment.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's one that can go unmotivated, right? It's one that, like, even if you feel that way, you ought to have some kind of argument, especially if, like, the result of that feeling is that people are going to be put to death, you know? Like, the stakes could not be higher, right? The stakes are incredibly high. So we ought to have our ducks in a row here. You know, we have to be very careful. So the points you're referring to that this person makes in order to get there is they are claiming that some people are just not capable of being rehabilitated, right? That's the first thing. And some people do things, like you mentioned, that are so like unforgivable or unspeakable that something has to be done, right? And when you have those two things combined, this is a person who's done such unspeakable things, and there's no way for them to be rehabilitated. What do you do with them, right? What do you do with them? One way is capital punishment. Another is something like life in prison, for example. Yeah. There are so many ways like we could go here in terms of which is more fitting. Amongst philosophers who are arguing for something like capital punishment, they use things like the principle of proportionality or the principle of commensurability in order to argue for something like capital punishment. Basically, the idea is this. Punishment is just in some cases, right? And when an offense has been committed that requires punishment in order to restore justice, it ought to be proportionate to the crime, right? It ought to be proportionate to the harm committed. And so what that means is that if you do something minor, like let's say you like stole a candy bar or something like that, it would be immoral or unjust for the state to like execute you for that, because the proportionality is way off. But on the other hand, if you killed someone, for example, in cold blood, not as like an accident, not manslaughter, like premeditated homicide, it would also be unjust for the state to keep you in prison for like a decade or something and then free you with no rehabilitation at all, right? Because the proportionality is off, right? So abolitionists, people who argue against the death penalty, their typical response to this notion of proportionality is to ask, why is the death penalty the highest punishment when we could just stop the highest punishment at life in prison, right? And then the highest crime, you know, killing someone or killing many people, gets the highest punishment, which is life in prison, and things are proportional. Like, what's wrong with that? There just seems to be something about the person losing their life that advocates for the death penalty find necessary for the restoration of justice in at least some cases.
Right. Yeah, it just seems, you know, unbearable that a person who committed such things can, you know, still potentially have a fulfilling life. Which, I mean, this actually gets to the next point that they brought up, where they're making the case that, let me just read it. Besides, killing them is more humane than locking them up in a 2x3 square for 50 plus years in the first place. And so, yeah, I've seen a lot of people argue that in some ways, life in prison, especially if you're in like a maximum security prison, where there might be a lot of violence and other terrible things going on, in some ways that could be worse than death. But I mean, when you were talking about the maximum punishment for like egregious crimes, you know, it made me think, you know, we've talked about this before in like other episodes, but like torture versus killing, like couldn't that also be something? It's not something we do, at least not explicitly. Like, we don't send people to be tortured, but we do put them in prison situations in which they will likely face a lot of violence and fear, maybe sexual assault. And so we allow them to be tortured in some cases, even if we don't, like, it's not state condoned necessarily.
Right.
But, it seems like that could also be in play. Like, if you're going to allow the death penalty, like, should that also be an option, do you think?
I mean, you make a good point that, like, if someone wants to say, like, oh, well, life in prison isn't harsh enough, there are worse things to do to a person than execute them, especially painlessly by, like, a guillotine or something like that, right? Like, you mentioned torturing a person explicitly, right, over a period of time could be far worse. So, but we don't do that. And I think most of us think that that's wrong. I hope most of us think that's wrong. So there's something, it's like execution for a lot of people, for some reason, is like in between these two extremes. Where it's like, well, there are some things you could do to these kinds of criminals that would be wrong. Like, we should not do that. But there are some things like life in prison that aren't serious enough. And for some reason, death is like in the happy medium. There's a lot of reasons that could be. One might be that in order to do something like torture someone, someone else has to get involved who is not themselves guilty in a way that could, like, harm them, like in a, like, moral sense. Like, they could harm themselves in inflicting this kind of damage upon someone. But you can make the same argument about execution. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, someone has to do the executing.
Right.
And some people actually want to do it. Like in cases of firing squads, people sign up to do that. They volunteer to do that. And sometimes they have to turn people away. So
perhaps a moral problem in and of itself.
Right.
Right. But one thing that this person does say in response to what we've been talking about in the last few minutes, they say in the very last sentence, for others, any sentence other than death is an insult to the victims, right? So they are not relying on, at least exclusively, this argument from proportionality. They are saying that in some way, the victims demand it, right? Like, it's the execution or the death of this criminal is required by the victims, either for closure or for, I don't know, like a feeling of safety or something like that. And I'm not so sure. I
wonder if this is like, I wonder if this is just, it's seen as respectful to the victims, or if it's like, people actually like taking into account what the victims feel, because there certainly are victims of, say a family member was murdered, they want the perpetrator to be killed to experience the death penalty, but there are other victims who don't want that. They want, even in some cases, they want like the person not to be in prison, like, like, should you
there are like well-known stories where some victims are family members of victims have practiced like radical forgiveness. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it could be, if we start considering, to be clear, I don't think we should dismiss the feelings of victims. It's, in general, especially, but even when it comes to like sentencing decisions, maybe there's some place for it. But I think we ought to be careful as well, because feelings amongst people can differ in extreme. And they're not always going to correlate with the crime committed. And if you set a precedent, that that the victims or the family of victims, their opinions on like what will satisfy and what won't are granted like a great amount of weight. I mean, if a person feels like they cannot possibly be satisfied unless like someone who burgled them is executed, like, I'm sorry, but I don't think justice demands your satisfaction in that case. And if I can say that there, why can't I say that in a more extreme case, like in a murder case?
Right.
Right.
I mean, I think you have to take in like the good of society in conjunction with what's good for the victims. And, and one argument for the death penalty is, maybe people need some sense of retribution, some sense of vengeance. And if they are not provided that by the state, they'll get it on their own. So if you have a criminal justice system that is too lenient on perpetrators of violent crime, let's say, then people will take matters into their own hands. They'll commit vigilante justice. And so you need something that's going to alleviate that need for the victims, but also balance that against the needs of society at large.
Right. I'm just not convinced that life in prison without parole is like a lenient sentence. That's devastating. That's I mean, as this person is suggesting, maybe even death would be more humane than that.
Right.
Maybe. I think if you asked death row inmates whether or not they would prefer to have their executions, stayed so that they could remain on death row, you might find mixed responses, but I'd wager that most of them would say, like, yes, I would like to continue living for a little while longer, even though this is not good. Right.
Right. I think it's into like why. I mean, I think part of that is something I kind of wanted to touch on. I want to bring back is we do put people in prison in situations where they may experience violence, sexual assault, and like in some ways we kind of like think that's good. So like an example is Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer. He was murdered while in prison by another inmate. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who think that was a good outcome, even though he was not. I believe he was not sentenced to death. He was sentenced to life in prison. Some people who think that that's a good thing. That like people experience these sorts of things in prison, but it's just sort of like by happenstance.
Prison justice, prison justice. It's seen as like just another consequence of the sentence or something like that. But as a matter of fact, like that's not in the sentencing, right? This is additional punishment. So,
and there's sort of a random element to it too, which makes it a little morally tricky, I guess. Like if you sentence people to like, okay, you're going to be in cells with all these other violent criminals, and like it's pretty likely that there'll be violence in the situation. That's one thing. But then if you just put them in kind of a random living arrangement and they sort of randomly interact with other inmates who some of whom are violent, some of whom are not, then you're just like rolling the dice, and that scene is like okay. So we're not technically saying like, oh, you're going to experience violence as part of your punishment, but we're just allowing that to happen.
Right. Now, maybe like the last thing they say that we should spend time on here is that they're very careful to explain that they don't think many people deserve death. In fact, it seems like they're trying to communicate that even some people who are like up for capital punishment now, under their system, maybe don't deserve to be. They want to make it clear that like only very serious sorts of crimes ought to qualify one for the death penalty. But when you make a claim like that, like only the extreme, like those who do torture and genocide and like serial killing, right? Only these people are the ones we should be, are the ones who deserve death. I can't help but feel like people who do those kind of things are not all there, right? Like, I don't think a normal person goes around life as a serial killer, right? Or like committing acts of genocide or torture. And I'm not making the claim that there's like necessarily diminished responsibility on their part. But I think like it's such an unusual circumstance that it requires us to look into the context, right? Like why?
Right.
It's just not a normal thing to do, right? A normal impulse for some like a homicide in a moment of like heated passion or something like that. Even if we can't empathize, we can understand how this happened, right? For like a one-off killing. But for like a serial killer or torturer or something like that, it's far more serious, right? Far more like sadistic. And that, to me, it's just, I'm like so incapable of understanding or empathizing with being in that mode that I cannot help but think something is seriously wrong with them.
Right. Yeah, we touched on this issue in our free will episode.
Yes.
Like, the extent to which you're free to make decisions, how much of that affects whether you're punished, in this case, like sent to death. Yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue. But, I mean, I agree with your point that, I've heard people when they talk about serial killers who like get caught doing something dumb, or like, oh, why would they do that? Why didn't they, just do something else to evade the police? It's like, these people are not in their right mind. Like, you don't, if you're playing with a full deck, you're not gonna like just break into people's houses and murder them. There's something wrong with them. Most of them experienced childhood abuse and all these terrible things. So that is something we could take into account. But there's other factors as well. Like, we didn't really talk about, like, deterrence is a big thing that people who are pro death penalty put on. So in that case, it doesn't necessarily matter why you did something. If having a large punishment for a crime makes people less likely to engage in that, then in that case, you might not even care why they committed it.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, the deterrence as like a reason for having the death penalty is often cited, but it's very contentious. Like it is an empirical matter, which means the evidence determines the facts, right? And quite a few people, like, who are death penalty abolitionists, point to the fact that it doesn't seem to deter. And so that's not a good reason. But then there are still others who point at punishment in general as being an effective deterrent. And in some specific cases, capital punishment as being a significant deterrent. For example, I mentioned Singapore earlier. They have a practice of capital punishment for 3 different kinds of crimes, right? Those that are involved with someone losing their life in an aggravated way, crimes that involve the use of a firearm, and finally, the importing and exporting of drugs, right? And that third one is like by far more contentious when it comes to other nations and their relations with Singapore, right? There are people who cite evidence that drug trafficking has decreased in Singapore as a result of instituting the death penalty over it, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good deterrent against killing people, right? It can be a good deterrent against something more minor and still not be an effective deterrent against something more serious, right? That tends to happen when you have like a small offense that is going to be drastically punished, like with a disproportionate force. That tends to be more effective at suppressing the crime, right? But that's not necessarily a good thing, right? That means there is like inherent disproportionality in the system.
Yeah, I think there's, like we were mentioning before, that people who do commit murders, like they already probably have something that's going on with them. Like there seems to be a lot that prevents people from murdering normally. And so if you are in a position to murder, you're already, probably have some mental issues going on. And so in that state, you're less likely to be influenced by, this is a capital crime versus like maybe spending life in prison. Like you're already, not really. There's some situations where maybe it's different. Like if you're a hitman, you'll decide like, I don't want to be a hitman in a state that has the death penalty. But
that's so rare though, in terms of like who is murdering who. Right. But yeah, you're right. Like, if the people who are committing most of these kind of crimes that at least this person is saying are deserving of death, are not going to be affected by like measures that generally affect rational people, like deterrence and that kind of thing, then the deterrence argument doesn't really work here. But again, I'm not suggesting that these people are capable of being rehabilitated. I think it's possible, though I don't know for sure, that some people could be so far gone that rehabilitation is not possible. Like, I think that's regrettable, but potentially possible. I guess I think it would be better, like more healthy in terms of a societal way of thinking, to see these instances less of like a failing of personal responsibility where the killer is concerned. Sure, maybe see it that way if you like, but also see it as a failing of like their environment, right? And try to like understand what can be done to prevent this kind of thing in the future, right? Like that I think is much more helpful than just saying, oh, well, we'll just execute them and then we'll wash our hands of it, right? Like, these people aren't normal. We need to understand why they are the way they are. Not just kill them because that's what justice demands, or that's what would bring relief to the victims, or something like that, right? That's
true. You could have both, though. Like, well,
you could have both.
Let's say in a situation where people are beyond rehabilitation, which I don't know about that. Like, we have this idea of the psychopath who's just like completely mentally screwed up, so that they are unlike normal people. I don't know how much that's true, and I don't know how much research has gone into actually trying to rehabilitate people like that. But assuming it is true, like, you could, execute people who fit that bill, who commit these terrible crimes, but also like try to identify the individual or like the societal factors that lead to that type of behavior. And if you believe in the deterrence of the effective deterrence of the death penalty, like, those two aren't incompatible. But again, like, deterrence, that's like a question for research to determine like how much that plays a role in whether people commit crimes or not.
I think it's also like, it's going to be fairly context dependent on whether or not capital punishment is acceptable, right? Like, we occupy a somewhat privileged position in that we can put these kinds of criminals into isolation for the remainder of their lives. Like, that's a thing we have available to us. Even if someone wants to suggest it's wasteful or not humane, it's a thing we can do. But that hasn't always been the case, right? Especially if you're in like in a much more like close-knit, disconnected community. You might not have other alternatives when someone is committing a crime as heinous as this person is suggesting, right? And in that case, maybe things change, right? Maybe the acceptability of such a thing changes, because what else are you going to do? Are you going to just like allow yourselves to be victimized endlessly, or take stronger measures? Now, I think like what I'm referring to are like far in the past historical civilizations, or like micro societies, right? Not like any sort of modern society, but still.
Yeah, so like the ethics of it could have changed over time, or like based on context, like the resources of the society, for instance. And because keeping someone isolated in a way that's not torturous, like they still have interactions with other people. It's not like solitary confinement, but it also keeps everyone safe. Like that's, not something that every society would have access to.
Right.
So the death penalty might be easier in that case.
Or, I mean, easier maybe is like a brutal way of saying it, but
Sure.
but like achieves as many of the like goals as can be achieved in that situation, right? Where those goals are like protect former and future potential victims, right, from additional harm, right? You want to prevent additional harm. That being like the primary goal, right? That's the main thing. You want to prevent this kind of harm from happening again, at least from this source, right? And then you might have some other goals as well, like deterrence or meting out of justice, right? And it might be the case that there is no way to achieve these goals if you don't have the resources as we do now, right? Other than maybe an execution or something like that.
Right.
Maybe. I haven't fully thought through that line of thinking, but it's out there.
Yeah.
The last thing before I think we should probably
there's
move
so
on
much
from
on
this.
this
Yeah.
one prompt. Yeah.
Last thing I want to say is that there are ways of arguing for the death penalty that don't have to do with deterrence, and they don't have to do with like it's for the victims or something like that, right? Like it's somehow like retribution or something like that. Kant, Immanuel Kant, a famous philosopher from long ago, his notion was that the death penalty was required for certain crimes, like killing a person, like homicide, not manslaughter, because the dignity of the criminal demands it, right? The dignity of the criminal demands that we execute them because this is the kind of way they have treated other people, right? So it's like the idea is that in treating someone else this way, they have, in a sense, for Kant, dismissed their personhood. In treating another person as like a means instead of an end, they have dismissed their own personhood. And the only way we can restore that for them is by carrying out the same for them, right? And so it's in a manner of speaking, returning them to the light of personhood by executing them. We're doing them a favor, right? So there's some like, it's not just deterrence or retribution. There are a few other interesting arguments for capital punishment out there.
Right. Yeah, I'm wasn't familiar with that one, but yeah, it reminds me of like, similar to the insult to a civilization kind of thing. I guess, except it's they're sort of giving up themselves as a person, and it's making them whole again in a certain way. By
right. Kant would say it's an insult to rationality, which for him just is humanity, right? So like, it's an insult to your own rationality to do that to someone. And the only way to restore it is to inflict the same. Shall we move on to an argument you found?
Yeah, so this is so from Twitter. So there's two comments here. The first one is more anti-death penalty. So they say, the death penalty is cruel, barbaric, and ineffective. America lacks the moral and scientific authority to execute its citizens. History will regard our propensity for state-sponsored revenge as the evil that it is. So I think there's enough here to just dive into this for a little while before getting into the response to this. So they talk, a bit about what we've talked about before, mostly being ineffective. The death penalty is ineffective, and so that's they don't specifically say how that is, but it could be, it doesn't
Deter.
Doesn't deter. I think that's the main way people think about such things. But there's a couple other interesting points here. That America lacks the moral and scientific authority to execute its citizens. It's not something I see a lot of, like talking about scientific authority here.
Yeah, you could unpack that in many different ways, right? They might mean that they don't have the scientific authority in the sense that they lack the ability to understand why people do what they do, and thus don't have the ability to see whether or not there's diminished capacity or responsibility for these cases. Or they might mean, like, we don't have the scientific authority to execute people because it can't be done in a non-barbarous way with our current understanding, right? Like, there are horror stories now of the more modern forms of execution, like lethal injection.
Yeah.
Horror stories of those going wrong. And so this person could be referring to things like that as well. Yeah.
Right. And that sort of like leads back to the argument for the guillotine. So like that's kind of something like that, I guess, is more like, at least could be more consistent. But the way I read scientific authority it made me think of false, like people being wrongfully executed, people who are innocent because perhaps you don't have you never have complete knowledge in a trial situation. So maybe this is what it made me think of. It's like forensics. Like we don't have perfect forensics, and people get executed who are innocent.
Yeah, I've read this person as saying, like, this is wrong and barbaric for those who are guilty, right? Now, of course, like, everyone is going to agree it's wrong to execute innocent people. Like, I hope everyone's going to agree with that.
Right.
Whether or not it's, like, a pill we're willing to swallow in order to enact vengeance or restore justice in cases where people are guilty, that's another question, right? That's where you'll have people dividing, like, sure, some innocent people get executed, but it's not very many, and these criminals really deserve to die, so it's still just, right? Others will say, if one innocent life is lost to this process, that's one too many.
I think each person might have different intuitions about how many is too many. Like, is one innocent person killed per 10,000? Guilty people killed, like, is that fine? Like, what about 100 or whatever? But it does seem like, in America at least, the rate is pretty high. Like, I would imagine it's, the single digits to maybe double digits out of 100, just based on the amount of overturns of death row convictions that have happened based on DNA evidence. And some cases are not, someone could be innocent, but there's no evidence that could possibly exonerate them. It's just that these people happen to have been convicted before DNA evidence was a thing, and then there was DNA evidence that happened to exonerate them. So it seems like it's fairly high, and each person has to decide, like, is that, if you're going to execute some people wrongfully, is that something are the pros of the death penalty sort of worth that potential cost?
Right. I think that's why some people, like the first poster we saw, want to restrict who is eligible in, like, a very, like, extreme way, right? I've seen other people arguing that restriction should be over the kind of evidence we have, not just over the kind of crime committed. So, for example, if someone is like I don't know, like, videotaped committing a murder, and then there's DNA evidence, and there's a confession, it's like a preponderance of evidence, then maybe it's okay to execute them, but not in other cases where there's even a modicum of doubt, right? Even those kinds of things can lead to worries, though. But this notion of, like, whether the state can get it wrong and how much that should weigh on our decision as to, like, how we feel about capital punishment, I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the arguments we found to come, right? So I think we're gonna get to that in a more serious way pretty soon here.
Yeah, so the last part of their comment that I think is interesting is history will regard our propensity for state-sponsored revenge as the evil that it is. And I think this is I think it's an interesting general argument when people make a moral case for what the future will think about us. And, is that, because I don't know, it seems a little weird to me I mean, on the one hand, if you look back in time, let's say at people who were abolitionists for slavery, when slavery was legal in the U.S., like you think like that was the moral thing to do. Like they're morally praiseworthy. Whereas at the time you might not have thought the same way about them. But it also seems a little weird to like choose behaviors and actions that you think the future will like reflect kindly on. I don't know. That seems like a weird way to make moral decisions, I guess.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking of it in that direction, that's sort of strange. Unless, of course, it's like something that will affect the future in a way that's foreseeable. Like how you respond to climate change, for example. That might be a thing where you should consider what history will think about you. When it comes to things like this, though, I think the point that they're trying to make is just that, like, this is so archaic that it should be seen as such now, and certainly will be in the near future, right? Yeah. So I think it's just like an expression of great disregard for this practice. Right. But they are seeing, like, pretty clearly the death penalty is just a form of revenge, right? In their first sentence, they dismiss the notion that the death penalty is in any way a deterrent. So I suppose for them, that's the only solution. That's the only thing left that the death penalty could be. Which leaves out this notion that it's not about revenge. It's about restoring justice, or so there's the notion of restoring justice through like proportionality, that sort of thing, and then there's the notion of protecting the innocent from further harm. Those are two things that people who support capital punishment would also typically cite here.
Right.
So it's not automatically clear that it's revenge. Right.
Yeah.
I can see the impulse, but they need a little more before they can say that directly.
Right. Yeah. I think we've covered that. So like the comment to this person says, conflicted. I have children, but would you support the death penalty if death landed on your front doorstep and someone close to you's life was taken, like your child? So this person's making the argument that, I see a lot of this where, people try to identify with the victims and say, you don't support the death penalty, but it's never been something that's directly affected you. And so we should think more in the ways of the victims that, you can have a stance until it affects you. You can't really think maybe the right way about it, or the victims are the people that we should be most thinking about. Yeah.
There's two ways to go about this, though, right? There's the, what if your child was killed, and how would you feel about their murderer, right? That's one way of viewing it, which is the way you've presented it, and I think the way they intend it. But another way of viewing it is, what if your child was up for death row, right? How would you feel there? And it's the same move, right? So if you're going to grant validity in one direction, validity in the non-formal sense, of course, then I don't know that you can stop it from granting it in the other direction, right? Like, otherwise, what is the move really doing,
That's an interesting point. I think, I wonder if some people, there is a lot of blame placed on the parents, especially, and maybe family members of people who commit crimes,
especially
like
when those criminals are young, right? And so it's seen like the parents ought to have had more influence or control over them.
And so, people may be less likely to empathize with the parents of the perpetrator rather than like the family of the victim because of that. Like whether that's right or wrong, I think that is something that's perhaps common.
Yeah. And second, like once again, I think that victims deserve support from like the community and the system, right? But I don't think that necessarily means that they ought to have the lion's share of the say in what happens to the perpetrator, right? Like, especially in a situation like this person wants us to imagine ourselves in. Like, if someone you love dearly, like a child, has just become a victim in like an unrevocable way, you know, like there's no way to take it back or to restore it. And they're like at your doorstep, right? As this person says, you are not going to be in a position to rationally like digest like these things, right? Like you are simply not going to be in a position to see things clearly. So unless what you want from our judicial system is for it to be like a rageful sort of satisficing, you know, like the only thing that can satisfy my rage or my grief is this punishment, then maybe we should not be putting ourselves in their shoes. Maybe we should seek to understand them, you know, and the harm that's been committed to them and the breadth of it, but not put ourselves in their shoes, at least when it comes time for sentencing.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think you know, one thing that made me think of is I don't think like anyone's really happy with our current, at least in the U.S., the current system of the death penalty, like including the victims, because you know victims certainly don't want to wait years for the perpetrator to be executed, and they may actually want torture or like a painful death, and in some cases they don't want any of that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, to some extent you'd want to honor what the victims want, just you know, just because if no one ever does, like that's extremely frustrating, and people are gonna, like I said, take matters into their own hands, and it's that's not just to completely ignore what people want, but at the same time you do have other factors to consider.
Yeah, in our current system, it's not like it's execution or nothing, right? Like these people go to prison for the rest of their lives. That's once again like not nothing. That in itself might be cruel and unusual. And so this notion of like, oh well, something ought to be done to them. It's like, well, it is. Something is being done to them. Something horrible is being done to them. You know, like imagine yourself in that position, like being in prison in this cell, right? Most likely isolated from the general population for the remainder of your life. And you know, you have foreknowledge, this will not change. It will never change, right? Like that is not a happy life.
Right. I mean, there is something to, I think victims might think that there'll be closure, or you know, if the perpetrator is killed, because you can think of situations where like you have a serial killer in prison and they're still giving interviews, and like you still read about them in the news or what have you. But again, that's something that's what research would determine. Like I mean, I don't really know if like closure in that sense really does follow someone being killed. I mean, that's, you know, so if a family member has been taken from you, like nothing's really gonna make you whole again. But even if you think it will, like I don't know if it necessarily does. Like you feel better with the offender who was killed. Like maybe that's not actually true. So I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but
no, I mean, I hear you, but like once again, how a victim feels about like what would restore them or like get as close to restoring them as possible, given that in some situations it will be impossible. How they feel about that isn't necessarily what's best. All we have to do to see that that's true is think of a crime that's less serious than homicide, right? Like, let's reduce it slightly, right? So instead of murdering a person in cold blood, our criminal has killed someone's beloved family pet, right? In cold blood, but they've done nothing else. This is the first crime they've ever committed. Mm-hmm. There are people who could react in such a way that's like that, would experience such grief that they think the only way it could be resolved if this person were, met with death. Some people hold like their pets to be like that close, right? Part of their family. But I don't think it's fair to say that just because they feel that way, it is necessarily true that that person, that criminal, ought to be executed. Right? And if you agree in that case, then room is open for agreeing in a more serious case, like a homicide. Mm-hmm. If you open the door, it remains open. And so I don't think we can say, well, this is what the victims feel like they need to have in order to reach some peace or something like that, and therefore it should happen, right? Should we take it into account? Possibly, but that should not be the only thing that matters.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a issue of people sort of projecting, like, if you think, what if like a close family member of yours was killed, a loved one was killed, like a lot of people would say, oh, I'd want the person who did that to die. Mm-hmm. And so having that sort of general idea like makes it seem like more okay than these other situations, which are much more like individual specific, where an individual wants someone to die in a situation where most people wouldn't. Maybe because it's easy, like as this commenter says, it's sort of easier to put yourself in someone else's shoes and think in a pro-death penalty way. Like maybe that makes it more acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can both empathize with the family member of a victim who has like been killed, right? Like the grief and the rage that they must be experiencing is like unimaginable, right? I think we can both acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't count for nothing, but once again, the stakes are very high here, right? We can't just afford to base our decisions just on that alone, right? Not when another person's life is at stake. We don't want to, in the pursuit of justice, create more victims, right? That's the last thing we want to do.
Yeah, I think that segues well into the next comment here. This might be the last one we have time for, but you want to...
Oh, really?
Go ahead. Yeah, we kind of spun off a lot, but
well, it's been good.
It's all good. Yeah.
Okay, so this next one comes from Twitter as well. They say, South Carolina executed 14-year-old George Stinney for a crime he was later exonerated of. The youngest person ever sentenced. He was tortured to death by the faulty electric chair, which burned his face and head. Death penalty is a tool of white supremacy. So there's some pretty powerful claims here. But before launching into them, maybe like a little background is necessary because they've mentioned a specific case. Yeah. This did happen in the 40s, I believe. In the 40s, a 14-year-old boy, was convicted of murdering two girls, also children. And within a matter of days, I think it was like, I don't know the number off the top of my head, so I won't pretend to. But within a short few days, was tried and then executed. And during this time, he wasn't allowed to see his parents except for a moment after the trial. So he had no counsel. He had no parental representation. And the only evidence that the state presented was the word of 2 police officers who claimed that he confessed to them with no written transcript or anything, just a claim that he had confessed, and that was it. That was all that the state provided, and his defense attorney did not move for any of the things he could have, really any kind of defense at all.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think it mentions it here, but
tragic.
This was a black child who was killed. And
yes.
I think it was 2 white girls.
Yes, that's true.
So that's hence the last part. The death penalty is a tool of white supremacy.
Yeah. So appeal was the word I was looking for. There was no attempt at an appeal or anything like that. Yeah. The verdict was just accepted, and he was very summarily executed. Later, like in the 2010s, his case was re-examined, and they found that the trial was just a farce, and he is considered exonerated now, but much good that does him all these years later. And so, yeah, the reason why I chose this one is because this claim that the death penalty is a tool of white supremacy. As we were referring to earlier, when we looked at one of your comments, it seems like the state does not get it right all the time, right? It does not get it right all the time. Sometimes innocent people are executed. And it is just a matter of fact that people belonging to certain minority populations, like black men, for example, face death row far more than other groups. It's just a matter of fact. And are thus more likely to be victims of this like unjust form of punishment, whether it's unjust in general or unjust because some of these people are going to be innocent. It's alarming, I think, the ways in which people have been placed on death row when they clearly did not deserve to be. Like, I encourage everyone to look into the Innocence Project. If you would like, you can, and you have access to Netflix, I'd recommend the Innocence Files specifically. They follow cases in which, like you were suggesting earlier, Lewis, we might not have the scientific authority to make the claims we are in regards to evidence, right? So they look at all of these cases in which evidence has been submitted that is just utterly bankrupt, right? Yeah. There's just nothing to it. Nevertheless, these people, because of this evidence, are like put on death row and are only exonerated many, many years, like sometimes decades later, thanks to more capable defense or exculpatory like DNA evidence, right?
Right. Yeah, there's things like bite mark analysis, I think was actually in the documentary you're talking about. Things that like are completely pseudoscientific that are used to put people in death row. And as you said, these people are generally marginalized groups like minorities, and they don't have access to a proper defense. And so I think this is a really interesting point that even if you do believe that the death penalty is moral, at least in principle, it is applied disproportionately. So the people that have fewer resources and have sort of less clout, I guess, in our society, those people are more likely to be executed, even if they are guilty. Right. But they're also much more likely to be found to execute it if they're innocent than people with more resources.
Right. And I mean, there is a larger problem that's more menacing, right? When you give the state a power over someone, that power can be yielded unfairly, like in a way that can propagate injustice. And if the state does not have that power, you can prevent at least some of that injustice, right? So one thing that this person is maybe alluding to is that by granting the state the power of the death penalty, you grant them another means by which injustice can be carried out further, right? And I mean, some people might think that's conspiratorial or something like that, but all you need to do is look at these cases like in the 40s, right, where there is direct evidence of this happening. George Stinney was in a courtroom. He was the only black person present, about 1,000 white people present, right? And he was found guilty and summarily executed at 14 years old in a matter of days without being able to speak to his parents. If that is not a mark of like racism present in the system, at least at that point, I don't know what is, right? When you give the state a tool like this, you have to accept that it can be used by people with bad intention. The state is not a machine that will like adhere to code perfectly, right? It has individuals in it that are faulty, individuals that are hateful, right? People that will use that power.
This makes me think of at the first internet argument we went over. They talked about how the death penalty should only be applied in cases where there's like kind of a slam dunk amount of evidence, like for sure the person did it. But there have been plenty of historical examples, like this case may be one of them. I'm not as familiar with that, where like a black man supposedly did some crime, and it was like an all white jury, all white, everyone involved, and they were like basically 100% sure that this person was guilty of whatever. Like they would have said, yeah, absolutely, like there's no way this person was innocent, and then they were later found to be innocent. So yeah, if you have these,
we're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird here, huh?
Yeah, well, I've only read like half of it, so I don't know.
but also real cases, many times over. Now the advocate for the death penalty has an easy response, at least easy in principle, right? The easy response is, well, look, if black people or other minorities are being executed at greater rates than people of other like positions, socioeconomic or by ethnicity, whatever, when they have committed the same crime, what we should be doing is just executing those other people more, right? We should like bring those numbers up to restore fairness, right? So the answer is not execute fewer people, it's execute more people to restore justice across those lines too, right? So there is a response that they could have, right? So, a white person who commits the same crime with the same amount of evidence against them as a black person with the same, right, is less likely to be sentenced to death. Yeah, that's wrong. They should be sentenced to death, and the execution should be carried out, right? That's how we restore justice, not by slowing down on the killing of murderers.
But there are other factors that play into that. It doesn't have to be overt racism. Like if, for instance, black people tend to have fewer resources, they'll be less likely to get adequate defense. And so things that could clearly exonerate them, or at least cast doubt into the juror's mind, might not be brought into trial as it would, on average, be more likely to happen for like a white defendant. And so even in cases where like it's not just that everyone's racist, like you can have these sort of inequities that lead to
for sure
marginalized groups.
Yeah. So the issue of socioeconomic status is another point at which we can point to the death penalty propagating further injustice, right? As you said, like a poor person is going to be less capable of mounting adequate defense than someone who is very well off, right? And it doesn't always just have to do with like the kind of defense attorney they could afford, whether it's one appointed to them by the state versus like a one from like private practice, who like defends celebrities and that kind of thing. Yeah. It can also be a matter of your perceived position in court, right? People of higher socioeconomic status are viewed more favorably in court, right? They are. It's easier to think that what they have done was like a fluke. It's not defining of them, right? It's easier to make excuses for them because they are so successful in other parts of their lives. And as you point out, I think rightly, this social economic separation that's going to cause this further injustice, there are racial tones there as well, right? People who are like coming up against the criminal system, who are like poorer, are also more likely to be black, right? And so, there's several degrees of injustice here.
I guess you could institute the death penalty for like white collar crime or something if you want to like make it a little more equitable racially.
Well, I think they might suggest something like a more serious suggestion might be something like you should not allow someone with high socioeconomic status to hire like these all-star teams or something like that. They should have the same level of defense. They should have the same level of defense as everyone else. But I don't think that's a good solution. Because these like overworked and sometimes like dispassionate public defenders are like, sometimes things happen, like George Stinney, right? And you don't want to subject anyone to that, whether they're wealthy or not. So I don't think that's the appropriate solution. Now, like the first person we saw, what they would likely say is, well, no, you have to have such a preponderance of evidence that this couldn't happen. We just need to update, what it takes in order to find someone like deserving of the death penalty. It has to be such a preponderance of evidence. But once again, with the bite mark stuff that you mentioned, what might be seen as strong evidence one day could be totally dismissed as laughable the next.
Right.
You'll never be in a position to know for sure with evidence of that kind, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I think an important issue in this topic is you can argue for the morality of the death penalty in principle versus the morality of the death penalty as it is done in any specific context. So like the way it's done in the U.S., it might have all these inequities in terms of like socioeconomic status or racism. But maybe you could do the death penalty in a way that it was not tied to those sorts of things. And for deterrence as well, as you mentioned with like Singapore, like maybe there is more of a deterrence if it's for lower level crimes, you have the death penalty, or if it's faster. Let's say like you're caught for a crime, tried quickly and then killed, versus in our system taking maybe decades for the person to be executed. So I think that is a important issue to consider.
Yeah. I think you're right on the money here with the division between speaking about its permissibility in principle versus like in practice, right? You can believe that some people deserve the death penalty and still think that there's not a way we can put the death penalty into practice in a morally just way, right? Those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can believe both, right? You can also believe that the death penalty is in principle immoral, right? And that it doesn't matter how it be put into practice, it's going to be immoral all the way down. But I think the distinction there is important because it allows people to have more nuanced positions, right? Just because you think the death penalty is in principle acceptable or maybe even required, it does not follow that you think or you should think the death penalty should be put in practice now, right? You can have a more nuanced position than that.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's been about an hour 15, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. And that was a pretty good summary, I think. So yeah, hopefully we injected some nuance into the debate, clarified the issue a little bit. Maybe
There's
this one
so much more to say.
Oh yeah, there's this. Yeah, we had a lot more to go through, but there's just, we could have talked about that first one for the whole time, honestly.
That's
true. Or
true.
at least use that as a jumping off point. But yeah, I think that's it for this episode.
Yeah, maybe we'll follow up at some point.
Yeah, there's a lot of other similar topics too.
Exactly.
Like we initially wanted to do a more broad topic, though it was too big. So yeah.
But I imagine we'll be returning to something like this at some point in the future. But for now, I think that's about it for this week.
Yep.
See you next time.
See you next time.